So like I was saying, this is the Baghdad Museum, and a lot of the antiquities from this region in Iraq were housed in this location. So after Desert Storm, a lot of the major pieces that were seeming like not to be quite so safe got moved here. Now what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to flip forward. If you're watching this at home, I'd like you to search for this clip. I'm not going to embed it into the presentation. I'd like you to visit this. It's a 20-minute, basically a 20-minute editorial piece kind of talking about what took place during the U.S. occupation and the initial invasion of Mission Iraqi Freedom, I guess it's called. So some of the figures, I know that that video is kind of interesting. If you were in class, I kind of stopped a lot and annotated the video because I did read quite a bit about this topic. I read a book called The Rape of Mesopotamia that basically talks about the policy that led up to these events taking place, the looting of the museum, and why some of the things happened, and the idea for the book is basically why did it happen and how can we prevent this. So just some things I want to throw out there. The soldier, and I forget his rank, but his name is, I believe it's Sergeant Bogdanos. He's the soldier that does most of the interviewing. I think he gets painted in a light that is a bit unfair. He was a huge proponent of trying to protect the museum. Because he was trained as an archaeologist, he was very concerned about these sites, about the museum, and but you also have to understand that he is a soldier and he's representing the U.S. Army and a specific position about how the events took place. So I would like you to know that he was very adamant leading up to the war and during it to make sure that this site was secured. Some of the other pieces about the firing positions that were put up on the museum, we do believe to be true. There are, documented photos of actually the museum having been fired upon, returning fire from these posts that were set up on the museum, and that's why the U.S. Army claims that they weren't able to go in there. There was also, we're dealing with an army, and we're dealing with people who need to go through a chain of command. Because a worker from the museum went over and said, go protect the museum to some people who are, some U.S. soldiers who are guarding another location, they can't just leave their post. They're soldiers, they're told what to do. They don't always have the ability to just kind of leave what they're doing and go somewhere else, okay? So a lot of different segments of the military were there. So we're talking Marines, we're talking Army, whose jurisdiction. Some of those things kind of got blurred in the planning of the war. The quick planning left some of these details out, like the specific coordinates to the museum. Imagine going into a new city that you've never been into, and you have to go to such and such a place, and you don't know even how to read the street signs. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, folks. Like I said, is it something that I agree with, that they should have let this happen? No, it's a travesty. That these pieces were stolen and the museum wasn't protected. But there is a wider, story that we need to be cognizant of. It's not so black and white. There's a lot of gray that exists in there. At the end of the video, you did see some of these Sumerian figures that were returned, so taken and returned. These votive figures, as they're called, were found in places like temples where the worshiping took place for a, goddess of a particular city or god of a particular city. One thing that we see is that they're very formula driven. It's kind of, like an avatar, like creating an avatar. You see, you could pick a beard, you could, have some hair, a long hair, short hair, a robe, maybe one that looks like it has feathers on the bottom, that kind of thing. But these figures, what's interesting about them is they're some of the first figures of common people. Okay, they're probably not you know, poor people, they probably would have to have money to have these statues made, but they're not kings, they're not queens, they're not princes. These are, you know, citizens of these cities. So this is one of the first times where you start to see that happen. Now, one thing that you'll notice about them, besides the praying hands, is that the eyes seem almost comically wide. The eyes are kind of symbolic in the way that they're represented as we're seeing them from the side, like an Egyptian um, painting. And these eyes are standing wide open, ever attentive, never blinking. Let's take a look at a piece from the Met in New York City. A couple pieces here, just highlighting some of the details, detailed work here. The hands clasped, the bright, wide eyes open. These figures were used for kind of I wouldn't maybe say used for. Let's say that they were often put in place of actual people. So they represented actual people, like an avatar would, but they are not specific portraits, like I was saying. But the idea was that these were offered or performed in some kind of fulfillment of a vow, in gratitude or devotion. I even read in the Epic of Gilgamesh that a votive figure was created for Gilgamesh's friend who died, so he would be remembered. So it may have also served that purpose. But a lot of times these things were placed in holy places to represent the people who could not go into these holy places. Okay. In some churches, the priest can only go behind the screens. Okay. So it's something like that. It's, in order for these people to be represented in front of their God that they're worshiping, was to put in kind of, a double, a stand-in. Okay, that's all interesting, and I think important for us to kind of know about, because it really gets at some of these beginnings of, sculpting the human form. But how does that relate to artists that are working today? I think one of the closest tie-ins to this really early sculpture is the work of Antony Gormley, a British artist who was born in London in the 50s. He's a award-winning artist. He won the Turner Prize, which is like kind of winning the Oscar for an actor, kind of guarantees that you are going to kind of be noticed and people are going to be kind of watching your work, and it's going to garner higher prices for your work. Winning that particular prize. And museums are going to seek out your pieces. He studied art history, anthropology, archaeology, and was really interested interested in the human body and its relationship between individuals, groups. Very interested in space, and you can see him amongst one of his installations of figures. Now, some of his work you can find on his website. If you get a chance, follow, I don't know if you can actually follow this link, but if you can find his website and go to Sculptures and Projects, look at some of the details under his field pieces. Here's a picture of one of them. Now, one of the interesting things is, if you remember in class the other day, I gave you a set of directions. Create a figure that is as tall as your hand, the head is in proportion, has deep set eyes, and can stand. That's exactly what he does. He goes out and collaborates with large groups of people and asks them to build these little sculpted forms, giving them those same set of restrictions. And this is what he does. He takes them after he fires them and installs them in gallery spaces. So the artist has this interest in archaeology. We know that. Okay, we know that these fields are kind of built in collaboration, so he's working with other people. It's not so important that he does all the work. It's more the idea behind this larger gathering of figures. But what what is similar that we see in the work is that these figures somewhat kind of resemble the votive figures in a way. They have these deep set eyes, which makes them look open and ever, attentive and non-blinking. They're looking up at us as the viewer, thousands of them, in a way that it makes us as the viewer feel large. In some ways, is he commenting on, the fact that these votive figures were put in front of gods to ever be worshipful? Is that the same thing maybe that's happening in some of these installations? Is it the clay? Is it the earth looking up at us longingly, asking, what are you doing with us? Is it more just about viewer and spectator? Is it about being aware of ourselves looking? Is it about space? Is it about the enormous amount of space that we take up in this world? I mean, these are all questions that I think that are interesting to ask and that kind of come to mind. I mean, just the sheer numbers. You ask yourself, why would one do this? And I think the artist really wants you to kind of answer that question. What do you think? It is left open for you to kind of decide how to take this. Is it an environmental stance? Is it a stance about cooperation or productivity? I mean, those are questions that I think you yourself need to answer. Now, what are we going to do with all of this information? Well, of course, we are going to make our own little field. The figures that I gave you, I did not model how to make the figure. I asked you to follow the directions that Anthony Gormley, normally gives the people he collaborates with, but he often models the sculpture so people get an idea of like what he's looking for. And there is something important in his work about uniformity. Now, I'm more interested in your personal expression, okay? I'm interested in you having some constraints put upon you and coming up with something and seeing what happens when we leave things a little bit open-ended. What do you end up making? And I think that those of you that finished your sculptures will know that looking around the room, there's very few people that created the same thing. Okay? Again, we're all coming from these different backgrounds, different histories shaping us, shaping what we like, our aesthetic, what do we think is beautiful, what do we think is interesting, and that is something that kind of comes through.